Hi everyone, welcome back. This is lecture 15.4, Powerful Empires in China. Today we will be talking about some of the many changes China went through during its 3,500 years of dynastic rule. Today's lecture will cover a period of time from 221 BC until 1911. I know, that's a long period of time. Don't be alarmed. We've already learned that China is somewhat isolated because of its many geographic features. We've also learned that this relative isolation has allowed it to develop a very unique culture over time, with powerful emperors under dynastic rule. We've also been given an overview of the three primary philosophies that have shaped Chinese culture over time, including Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. A belief system or religion that has influenced the Chinese and has been incorporated in day-to-day life over time in China is Buddhism. Well, one of the first glimpses Europeans had of Chinese culture was from an Italian traveler named Marco Polo. Yep, it's not just a game you play in the swimming pool. Marco Polo. Yeah, well, Marco Polo traveled to China in the late 1200s, and he stayed for 17 years. Wow, that's a long vacation. Marco Polo recounted his experiences and his journey in a number of books, including one called The Travels of Marco Polo. Marco Polo ventured into China during a period of Mongol rule by Kublai Khan, who eventually started a new dynasty in China called the Yuan Dynasty. Marco Polo reported on practices and life in China in his travel books. Much of what he reported was pretty shocking for Europeans, many of whom refused to believe what he had written. Things like, people in China frequently bathe. Most people in Europe at the time did not bathe very often. Additionally, Marco Polo noticed paper currency, not gold or silver, as was used in Europe at the time. So this was very shocking for Europeans to hear. Many Europeans refused to believe that China could possibly be more advanced than Europe. Well, the fact of the matter was that Chinese, they had an extremely advanced civilization, most likely the most advanced civilization by the year 1276. And by 1276, China already had a rich history of dynastic rule. Their technology was far superior to anything Europeans were creating around the same time. We've already learned in class that the first official dynasty in China was the Qing Dynasty. We also learned about the creation of a pictograph and ideograph-based writing system that emerged and transformed into a system of thousands of complex characters. Following the Qing came the Zhou Dynasty. It was under this dynasty that China broke up into various independent states. Well, a leader named Shi Huangdi is going to reestablish a single Chinese kingdom, and he's going to claim the mandate of heaven to reestablish dynastic rule in China. Shi Huangdi overthrew the last of the Zhou dynasty and became known as the first real emperor of China, establishing the Qin Dynasty. He adopted legalist principles to rule over his people and created an orderly society. Remember legalism? Yeah, it was one of the three governing philosophies in early China, based on strict laws and harsh or severe punishments for breaking those laws. Shi Huangdi consolidated his power and is remembered as one of the most powerful emperors in Chinese history. Future emperors will follow his lead. Some argue that it was because of Shi Huangdi, whose name translates as first emperor, that dynastic rule continued until 1911. So what was Shi Huangdi known for? Well, that totally fascinating, not an inaccurate video that we watched in class talked about some of his achievements, remember? Shi Huangdi's first major achievement was the unification of China. How does one accomplish this task? Well, Shi Huangdi created a single law code, or a uniform system of rule. Making sure all of your people are required to follow the same rules will really make things easier in terms of organization. You can't have different laws in different provinces. That would be like having different rules in every classroom at this high school. That would be really hard to keep track of, In addition to having a single, more uniform legal code based on legalist philosophies or principles, Shi Huangdi is also given credit for standardizing measurements across China, introducing a new currency, or money, and he created an organized road system to make transportation and government administration easier. In order to keep life in order in China, Shi Huangdi was a totalitarian ruler in that he controlled all aspects of people's lives, including which books they were allowed to read. Shi Huangdi banned Confucian philosophy books and made everyone adhere to legalist philosophies, which basically reject Confucian ideals. Shi Huangdi had the Great Wall of China built in order to protect his territory from invasion. Many Chinese peasants died during its construction. The Great Wall extends over 1,500 miles. It failed to keep out invaders, however, and contrary to what that silly video told us, astronauts cannot see it from space. Thanks for looking that up, folks. However, it did become an important symbol for the Chinese, who viewed people north of the wall as barbarians and those south of it as quote-unquote civilized. Yes, clearly that seems ethnocentric, but it's not a new concept in history. Wait until you study the Greeks next year as 10th graders. You're going to see a very similar feeling towards those people who lived outside of Greece. Anyway, Shi Huangdi died, and various groups fought to determine who would rule China. Shi Huangdi's sons and other emperors eventually constructed a massive mausoleum for their emperor, guarded by thousands of warriors. These terracotta soldiers are thought to protect Shi Huangdi in his afterlife. Eventually, Liu Bong gained power during a period of upheaval following Shi Huangdi's death, establishing the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty lasted from 206 BC until 220 AD. That's a long time for a single dynasty to be in power. Wow. The Hans made many achievements in over 400 years. Perhaps their most well-known was the establishment of a vast trading route across Asia called the Silk Road. The Silk Road spanned Central Asia, stretching from Xi'an in eastern China all the way to Antioch in Asia Minor, on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, in a nation that we now call Turkey. Essentially, the Silk Road allowed for the transfer of goods and ideas, aka cultural diffusion between Europe and Asia, and it can be considered, really, Internet 1.0. Trading along the Silk Road was often dangerous. There were raiders or bandits lurking about, ready to attack unprotected or unsuspecting travelers. Despite this, new products made their way to China, like oranges, peaches, and pears, and then also the Chinese exported things like the wheel, modern writing, tapestries, gunpowder, belief systems, paper, as well as the printing press that Gutenberg later modified and received credit for in history. The Silk Road also allowed for the spread of Buddhism into China from India, which still impacts people's lives in China today. The Han Dynasty made some changes in how they ruled their people. Unlike Shi Huangdi, who outlawed Confucianism and was legalist, Han leaders were different. They outlawed legalist practices and reestablished Confucian philosophy in society. Under Confucian philosophy, only the most qualified and educated people were allowed to hold government positions. It was under the Han that the civil service system was reestablished. The civil service system, you already learned in lecture 15.3, was set up to ensure that qualified people held government positions based on their merit, not on who they knew, their birth or wealth, etc. The Han Dynasty set up a complex examination system across China in order to attract the most qualified people for government work. Exam questions were based on Confucian philosophy, history, law, as well as other topics. The Han Dynasty also set up a university system to train their government civil servants and officials. The civil service examination system in China ensured that social mobility was possible, although not easy. Someone from even the lowest social class could work their way up the social hierarchy or social ladder. This is unique because in many other places that we've learned about this year, social mobility has not always been possible. Remember the caste system from India? Social mobility is not possible under this system in one's own lifetime. And although the Chinese adopted Buddhism from India, if you recall, Buddhists reject the caste system. Maybe this was another reason Buddhism was appealing for people in China, and maybe another reason it didn't catch on, really, in India. Who knows? So, the civil service system provided the Chinese with qualified officials and civil servants. Did you know that only 1% of students actually passed these exams? Yeah, talk about competitive. I think even Harvard has an 8% acceptance rate. Just saying. Those who managed to pass had jobs for life as civil servants, and they were given the name mandarins. Confucian scholars had to memorize 400,000 characters, and they took a series of exams, not just one. So count your blessings, kids, with only one or two college entrance exams like the ACT or SAT. Exam conditions, believe it or not, weren't too different from your own, although I think they were even stricter. Belongings were searched, and the scholars had to settle themselves into these small cell-like structures for 3 days. Yep, you heard me. Their exams were 3 days long, and it was like living in a prison. Yikes! So, besides the civil service system, there were some other major Han achievements. They made improvements to the Chinese calendar, they invented scientific tools like an early seismograph, and they were especially well known for their medical contributions like acupuncture. The Han also improved their farming methods and created mini-controlled flood systems to irrigate their fields, and they're credited with creating the wheelbarrow, a water clock, as well as sundials. The Chinese were also able to improve on other inventions brought from places like India. After the Han Dynasty, there was another 1,000 years of dynastic rule. Two dynasties that followed the Han included the Tang and Song dynasties. Both of these dynasties ushered in a golden age for China. A golden age, we've already learned this year, is a good point in history when progress is made in a variety of areas. There's usually a steady food supply so people can focus on other objectives. During Golden Age periods, there's usually much progress made in the arts and in literature, as well as in exploration. During the Tang and Song dynasties, there's evidence to suggest that they developed complex ships with rudders that allowed sailors to more easily navigate rough waters and control their boat's direction. It's thought that the Tang and Song dynasties engaged in foreign trade by sea. Because of this exploration, trade, and general contact with other parts of the world, there are soon going to be foreigners living in China for the first time during the Tang and Song period. Muslims from Persia and Arabia, along with Jews and Christians, settled in major shipping centers in China. The Tang and Song empires also made significant progress in literature. Their creation of a printing method called movable type allowed for significantly faster book production. Before movable type, books were written by hand. Whoa! A famous poet from the Tang and Song period was Li Bo, who wrote extensively about the natural world and the intricate beauty found there. This type of writing by Bo clearly reflects Taoist principles that are so heavily ingrained in Chinese lives even today. Other artistic achievements during the Tang and Song Golden Ages included progress in painting. Inspired by Taoist principles, artists created simple yet elegant scenes based on nature. The Song Empire was taken over by a group of people called the Mongols, who hailed from Central Asia in what we now call Mongolia. The Mongols will eventually conquer much of Asia and parts of Europe using superior horsemanship skills and an important device called the stirrup. Using saddles that had stirrups attached to them allowed the Mongol warriors to stand up in a steady fashion while galloping on their horses. By steadying themselves in the stirrup, they could load their bows and fire arrows at their enemies quickly and with precision. This seemingly simple technology allowed the Mongols to conquer much of the known world. The Mongols eventually set up a system of rule called khanates across their empire. They were amazing warriors, not the best leaders, however. Once they conquered an area, they tended to get a bit lazy, in that they handed off the governing to the local people. However, they still made sure that local government obeyed. How? They demanded a yearly payment called a tribute from the people they conquered. One of the most powerful Mongol leaders was Genghis Khan. Once he died, he divided up his empire amongst his sons. Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan, took over much of China and eventually established what became known as the Yuan Dynasty. So if you think of the Mongols in China, think of the Chinese Khanate as the Yuan Dynasty. Kublai Khan initially tried to resist Chinese influence and was opposed to Confucian philosophy and the civil service system. But Khan finally gave in to this and allowed Confucian officials to help rule or govern his territory. The result was a golden age. The Mongols made many achievements as the Yuan Dynasty. Khan welcomed foreign guests and travelers like Marco Polo. Remember from earlier in my lecture? Marco Polo actually worked in the Yuan government, which allowed him to collect much material for his travel books. The Yuan Dynasty helped promote a Mongol Golden Age referred to as Pax Mongolia, or Mongol Peace. It is a great example of yet another Golden Age in history. The Mongols in China helped update technology and create things like complex rudders for boats, mechanical clocks, gunpowder, and updated printing techniques. Mongol power began to decline following Marco Polo's journey and sejour in China. The Mongol Empire in China under the Yuan Dynasty fell apart by 1368, and a man named Zhu Yangsheng captured the territory in Beijing. He eventually changed his name to Ming Hung Wu, and he established a dynasty called the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty ruled from 1368 to 1644 and experienced a golden age as well. I'm seeing a trend here. The Mings built the Forbidden City in Beijing for their emperor. They also conducted many overseas travels, and they are thought to have traveled as far away as Southwest Asia, India, and Africa. For reasons unknown, dun dun dun, even today, the Mings suddenly stopped their overseas exploration and became culturally isolated. They began limiting the number of foreigners allowed in China, and they no longer permitted Chinese citizens to travel outside of China without permission. In 1644, a new dynasty took over. The new dynasty hailed from a region called Manchuria, and they set up a dynasty called the Manchu or Qin Dynasty. The Qin rulers expanded China's border to include many Southeast Asian provinces like Burma, Thailand, Laos, Nepal, Vietnam, and Korea. The Qins remained in power until 1911, but more on that later.